Okay, so question 11 asked you to account for the effect of immigration on the changing pattern of religious adherence in Australia from 1945 to the present. So what we need to do first is to break down the question. So step 1 would be to identify the verb or action word, which is account. Now, this is essential to identify because it tells you what you need to do in order to answer this question. Now, account means to state reasons for. Okay, now we need to look at the content that's being addressed. So firstly, we can identify 1945 to the present is relating to the syllabus dot point of religious and belief systems post 1945. Now, more specifically, we are looking at religious adherence. Okay, and religious adherence is basically the religions that people were following. Okay, to adhere to a religion is to follow one. Alright, now we can also identify from the content that we are looking for at immigration. Alright, and immigration as a term refers to the action of moving or going to live in a foreign country. Alright, and this term is important because you are focusing on the idea of immigration. So you're looking at how religious adherence had changed as a result of people moving to Australia. Okay, so there really isn't a need to mention anything else unless immigration impacted upon that, and then that impacted upon religious adherence. Okay, so be mindful that immigration does limit the scope of what you'll actually talk about. Now, some other key terms that you should pay attention to in relation to this question is the effect. Okay, so you could look at that as impact and changing pattern. Alright, so we're looking at, what changes occurred as a result of immigration. Now, if we wanted to reword this question in order to make it a little bit more accessible, a little bit more easy to understand, you could write it like this. State reasons why immigration was changing religious adherence in Australia post 1945. Okay, so obviously from 1945, we're not dealing with anything prior to that. Okay, so now that we have our question broken down, we should be able to answer it just by identifying, what we actually need to do and the content that we're focusing on. Okay, so now that we have broken down the question and identified what we need to do, maybe even reworded the question to make it more accessible, hopefully it's become clear that you will need to consider the following. Firstly, where people were coming from and why. So, looking at the events that had occurred that led to people fleeing their homeland in order to move to Australia. And secondly, how this altered census data that represents people's religious adherence. So, what changes were noticeable and how can they be linked back to these events? Okay, so some of the strongest answers obviously address the question requirements and pinpointed the events and the impact or change that these events had caused in religious adherence in Australia post 1945. Now, these answers included some to all of the following information. So firstly, the impact of the White Australia policy. Firstly, having it implemented within Australia restricted the amount of non-white immigrants. So Christianity at that time was the dominant religion. Now, when the White Australia policy was abolished, this led to an increase in Buddhism, Hindu and Muslims. Also, the Civil War saw an increase in the number of adherents to Islam, and also a rise in Hinduism as people were migrating from India and Fiji. The war in the Middle East also saw Muslims migrate, and this impacted upon adherence to Islam in a positive manner. That is an increase in numbers. Now, World War II was quite significant, firstly because it contributed to the growth of European immigrants, and this affected Orthodox Christians, also the establishment of Protestant groups, and the growth in number and diversity of Catholics. Now, it also impacted upon Jewish adherents in the sense that they were fleeing persecution by the Nazis and often found their way to Israel or other Western countries such as Australia. Now, what was interesting to note was the amount of people that made mention of New Age religions. And this was a little bit more difficult because for some of you, you did not make a connection to how immigration had led to an increase in New Age religion. So be mindful that it is relevant if that connection is made. So for example, those who received a mark often highlighted the fact that with immigration, the number of non-Christians increased, and as a result, this led to the development as well as an increase in adherents that were following New Age religions. Okay, so you can see that there is a connection being made between immigration and New Age religion. So please just be mindful of that and that you include it in order to get the mark. This is the marking criteria for question 11. I just felt that it was important to include it so you could see what you were getting marked on. Now, I have broken down the marking criteria and you can see that it links directly to the original question breakdown, which is always the case. So have a read through this just so that you can come to an understanding of where you've received the marks, but also what you may have missed